Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to switch gears and get into sexual reproduction in this video. So we're continuing in on chapter 6, reproduction at the cellular level, in our OpenStax textbook. If you're in Campbell Biologies, we're switching to chapter 10. So again, we've been focusing in on mitosis, and that's kind of a form of asexual reproduction. So now we're going to get into sexual reproduction with 6.5. So most eukaryotes undergo sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, one of the main, well actually the main advantage of sexual reproduction is that it introduces variation into the population. And so we're going to start out by looking at sexual life cycles. And this will give us a foundation so that in the next video we'll learn about meiosis, which is how we create gametes. Okay, so it's a little different from mitosis. So we'll take a look at that so that we can produce these genetically unique gametes. And then once the gametes fuse together to form a zygote, a fertilized egg, they're a unique combination of the parents' genes. Okay, so that way the offspring are genetically unique from the parents. So by the end of this video, you should be able to explain that variation among offspring is a potential evolutionary advantage resulting from sexual reproduction, as well as describe the 3 different life cycle strategies among sexual multicellular organisms and their commonalities. So let's start out by talking about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. So let's start out with, first of all, asexual reproduction has quite a few advantages to it. Okay, so if you think about asexual reproduction, we talked about it in the last video. It can, especially with the prokaryotes cell division, that's a form, binary fission is a form of asexual reproduction. It can happen really quickly, okay? You can think about, the bacterial cells. They, if the conditions are just right, they can just start dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing. Okay, so they can, utilize the resources and start replicating quickly and passing those genes to their offspring. Okay, they don't have to, sit there and try to find a mate and waste resources in order to create offspring. Okay, so that is an advantage for asexual reproduction, but that means that sexual reproduction has a few disadvantages. So if a parent is successful in a particular habitat, only half of its genes will go to the next generation, okay? Because, only, if you think about it, you're only half your mom and half your dad. So if one parent in the environment is really, really successful, only half his genes go to that offspring, okay? So you're only contributing half of your genes to the next generation. So that's a disadvantage of sexual reproduction, okay? Whereas asexual reproduction, 100% of your genes go to the next generation, okay? Another disadvantage is that in sexual reproduction, you have to expend energy trying to find and attract a mate. Okay, so you have to, actually find an opposite, usually especially for animals, you have to find an opposite gender in order and find somebody to mate with. Plants, that's a little different because a lot of plants have both genders. They have both sperm and eggs, so it's a little bit different. But and some other organisms, but for sexual reproduction, you have to spend that extra energy finding and attracting a mate. Okay, so that's just extra energy that's expended into trying to pass your genes on to the next generation that asexual reproduction does not have to deal with. Okay, and then finally, one of the genders can't make babies. Okay, so so that's another disadvantage. Well, it could be an advantage if you think about it, but so the fact that for animals, half the population can't make babies. So if there's a population struggle, gaining the number of individuals trying to grow the population, and only half the population can actually grow the population, then the population can struggle. Okay, so there's a disadvantage in that case, whereas in asexual reproduction, everybody can divide through binary fission and replicate. Okay, so the population can grow really quickly through asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, only half the individuals can actually make the babies. Okay, so there's quite a few disadvantages of sexual reproduction, but there's one big advantage, and that's that the offspring are genetically unique. And this is a very big advantage when the environment is constantly changing. Okay, so if the environment changes and the population is varied, there's genetic uniqueness within the population, then that means that there's at least a few members within the population that will be able to survive and adapt to those changes in the environment. And so the population should be able to survive and continue and repopulate, even if there's a drastic change in the environment. Whereas if individuals reproduce asexually and everybody's genetically the same, and the environment suddenly changes, then most likely they won't have the adaptations that allow them to survive that big change, because everybody's genetically the same. So everybody has the same genetics, and none of those genetics allow them to survive that change, so everybody is wiped out and dies off, and the whole population could collapse. So sexual reproduction gives an evolutionary advantage. So if it allows for populations to adapt to changes, and that promotes evolution. Okay, so there is there's some disadvantages to sexual reproduction, but there's a big advantage to sexual reproduction. It promotes adaptation due to the genetically unique offspring. Okay. So some of you may have heard of the Red Queen hypothesis. So the Red Queen hypothesis, you may have heard of this quote: "It takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place." So this basically means that all species, they co-evolve with other species. So for example, we have like predator-prey relationships, or like parasites co-evolving with their hosts. And so if we have like a predator-prey relationship, where there's like a classic example of a predator-prey relationship with in this area in the Pacific Northwest, we have the rough-skinned newt and the garter snake. Okay, so these are two organisms that live here in the Pacific Northwest. The newt is an amphibian that lives in riparian areas and in our streams. And then we have the garter snake that you've probably seen sometimes, if they might be like in your backyard and things like that. They eat like slugs, and they eat all sorts of creatures that you probably don't really want to encounter in your yard. So they're good backyard buddies for you. Don't kill them. They're actually very beneficial for your garden. But anyway, they've actually co-evolved together. So if you know anything about the newt, the Repskin newt is incredibly poisonous. It's not venomous. I mean, if it bit you, it's like, no, whatever. But it's not. Its skin is incredibly poisonous. And it's so poisonous that, like, just one little drop of the secretions on its skin could kill you. I mean, it's very, very potent stuff. But why is it so potent? Okay, well, it's evolved to be so potent, and it's this co-evolution that's taken place between its predator, the garter snake, and the prey, the newt. Okay, so the newt is very, very poisonous because of the garter snake. Okay, its predator. So the newt becomes more poisonous to avoid getting eaten by its predator, the garter snake. And in the same time, the garter snake becomes more tolerant of the poison of the newt. Okay, so it's this idea of it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. So the newt's becoming more poisonous to, be able to not get eaten by the garter snake. And then the garter snake is evolving along with it to allow it to be able to eat the newt, even though it's highly toxic. I mean, there's some issues with the garter snake after it does eat the newt. It's kind of, it can't move for a while, but it can still digest and everything. But anyway, it's this idea of co-evolution. So they're co-evolving together. So this newt is becoming more and more toxic to avoid getting eaten, but then the garter snake is becoming more and more tolerant of the toxin so that it can eat the prey. So they're basically co-evolving together. So that's this Red Queen hypothesis. It takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. Okay, and that's all it has to do with this sexual reproduction. So you can think of the newts that are more toxic are going to survive longer than the newts that are less toxic. Okay, so they're going to survive longer and pass those genes on to the next generation. But then the same with the garter snakes. The ones that are more tolerant to the toxins are going to survive longer and pass those genes on to the next generation. The ones that are, less tolerant to the toxins will get killed off. And so they're co-evolving together, and eventually they just end up being in the same place. Okay? So that's kind of an idea of co-evolution between competing species. Okay, so let's get into the life cycles of sexually reproducing organisms. So what is a life cycle? So life cycles, those are just sequences of events in the development of an organism and the production of the cells that produce the offspring. So if you think about it, we have the offspring are produced by the union of two haploid gametes through a process known as fertilization. So those haploid gametes, so for example, for us humans, it would be sperm with 23 chromosomes and egg with 23 chromosomes uniting to form a fertilized egg known as a zygote. And that zygote, since it has two sets of chromosomes, it would be diploid. Okay, and that fertilized egg is considered a diploid organism at that point. And then it undergoes mitosis, divides and divides and divides. It becomes an embryo and then becomes a fetus and then becomes a baby and then, becomes a, fully functioning adult human eventually. That will then undergo meiosis inside of his or her gonads, which are the gamete producing organs of the body, to produce haploid cells or gametes. Okay, so to start the whole process over again. Okay, so we'll actually talk about this process of meiosis where instead of dividing in cells into identical copies like we did in mitosis, Meiosis involves nuclear division that results in haploid cells, okay, that are genetically unique, okay, so it's producing gametes instead of somatic cells, or instead of, like, identical daughter cells. So we'll talk about that in the next video, so not this video. But just realize that our sexual life cycles, they involve the haploid stages, so that is, involves the gametes, and then the diploid stages, so that could be, where we have the organism involved. Remember, haploid means one set of chromosomes, diploid means two sets of chromosomes, okay? So we have three main categories of life cycles in multicellular organisms. So we're dealing with multicellular organisms. We're not dealing with a single-celled, okay? So we're dealing with plants. So all plants are multicellular. Animals, fungi for the most part, algae. So we're talking about those types. We're talking about all, eukaryotic cells, because prokaryotes are all single-celled, okay? So we're talking about multicellular organisms. And there's three main categories. They can be diploid dominant, so, spend the majority of their time in the diploid stage. Haploid dominant, spend most of their time in the haploid stage, or the alteration of generations life cycle. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of these life cycles. We'll talk about them, and then we'll talk about what type of organisms are likely to have that life cycle. Okay, so we'll start with the first one, diploid dominant. So diploid dominant is which is the one that we have, and most animals have this one, and it's where our where we spend the diploid stage is basically the most obvious stage of our life cycle. So we are diploid. So us as an organism, we are diploid multicellular organisms. Okay, so you as a human being are diploid. Okay, so here are, human beings, male, female. So as male, female, females have, males and females both have gonads. So gonads are gamete producing organs. And so females have ovaries. So ovaries undergo meiosis to produce eggs. So inside the ovaries, there are diploid cells. So diploid, remember, means, two sets of chromosomes. There's specialized diploid cells, which we call germ cells. So these are different from somatic cells, which we learned about earlier, which are typical body cells, like your heart cells and your brain cells and your skin cells. But inside the gonads, there are germ cells. So these germ cells will undergo meiosis instead of mitosis. So meiosis is a process that produces gametes. So if it's undergoing meiosis in the ovaries, the germ cells produce eggs. If it's undergoing meiosis in the testis, or testes plural, then it's producing sperm. Okay, so these diploid organisms are producing haploid gametes. Okay, now once we have haploid gametes, then the haploid egg and the haploid sperm will unite through fertilization to form a diploid zygote, or fertilized egg. And that starts the diploid stage. Okay, so there's just a brief period of time where we have a haploid stage. Notice the haploid stage is a single-celled stage. Okay, and then the diploid stage, you only have a very, very brief time when you're a single-celled, a zygote, and then you start undergoing mitosis, and then you grow and grow and grow until you are an adult human being. Okay, so most animals are diploid dominant. All right, so they spend most of their time in the diploid stage, but you produce haploid gametes. A haploid dominant is the opposite. Okay, so they spend the majority of their time in the haploid stage. So that's the most obvious. All fungi are haploid dominant. Okay, so they spend their time in the haploid stage. Okay, so if I look at a what are called hyphae, which is basically the fungus underground, that hyphae is haploid. All right. Some algae also are haploid dominant. So what happens is you have the hyphae. So by the way, the mushroom part is actually the sexually reproducing part of the fungus. So the actual majority of the organism is underground. Okay, so the underground is this hyphae, which forms this what's called this mycelium mat. Okay, so we have these hyphae, which are basically these little cells of these haploid cells. Okay, so these haploid cells will undergo mitosis, and they can produce spores. Okay, so spores are just, they're haploid. Okay, so they can land and then they can undergo mitosis and grow more. Okay, so it's just through asexual reproduction, basically. All right. They can reproduce sexually. So if you have like a hyphae from one part meeting with a hyphae from another part, they can have two spores meeting. So if you have two haploid spores meeting, you can form a diploid zygospore. Okay, and that'll form a zygote. Right, so if we have a zygote, that would be diploid. And then immediately, once we have the zygote, it will undergo meiosis to form spores again. Okay, the haploid spores. So most of the time it's undergoing mitosis, and with these spores, it's just in the hyphae is elongating through mitosis, and it's just producing these haploid spores for asexual reproduction. But it can briefly do sexual reproduction by fusing spores together into a diploid stage, where then that structure can then undergo meiosis in order to produce haploid spores. All right. So it's a little different strategy. So they're spending pretty much their entire life in the haploid stage, and then just briefly the spores basically come together, fertilize, and then undergo meiosis really quickly to go back and into spores again. All right. And then finally we have alteration of generations. So in alteration of generations, they can spend, both sometime in the haploid stage and sometime in the diploid stage. So a lot of plants, so pretty much plants and algae do this alteration of generation. So not all plants, but some plants. So we have the diploid stage. So when we have the diploid stage, we call the plant the sporophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte is produced from a zygote through fertilization. So you have a sperm meeting egg, and then that forms a zygote, and then you undergo mitosis to form a sporophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte will produce these things called spores. And these spores will then undergo, the sporophyte will produce these sporangia, I should say. And inside the sporangia, it'll undergo meiosis to produce spores. So these are haploid spores These haploid spores will then get released and will land somewhere. And when they are released, they land somewhere, they will undergo mitosis to form what's called a gametophyte. So this gametophyte is haploid. It has one set of chromosomes. So this will start growing, and this will produce a type of gamete. It'll produce sperm or it'll produce eggs. Okay? And then it'll release the eggs or release the sperm, and then the sperm will unite with the eggs, and then the process starts over again. Okay? So, plants are a little different in the sense that, they have this alteration of generation. So this is a ferns. You can see that, the part that you normally see, the leafy part, this is diploid. But then if you look under the leaf, these sporangia, they will contain spores that are haploid. And then you might see, like on the ground, you might see these little gametophytes growing that are haploid. Okay? If you look at a tree, trees are diploid. Okay? But then, like if you think of a pine cone, pine cones, they will have like the inside, they'll have like the pine cone with like the ovule and which contains eggs. Okay, so it's actually contained, the gametophyte's contained inside, so it's a little different. All right, so they don't actually have like a physical haploid gametophyte that you can see. Okay, like the ferns. All right. But yeah, so you can see that they spend some time in a physical multicellular haploid stage with the ferns, and a physical multicellular sporophyte stage, diploid stage with the ferns. So they have a haploid gametophyte and a haploid sporophyte. All right. All right, so let's do some review questions. So what is a likely evolutionary advantage of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction? Is it A, sexual reproduction involves fewer steps, B, less chance of using up the resources in a given environment, C, sexual reproduction results in a greater variation in the offspring, or D, sexual reproduction is more cost effective? If you said C, I would agree with you. So remember, the biggest advantage of sexual reproduction is that you end up with genetically unique offspring. And that's basically the only advantage of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction involves a lot of steps. Okay, there is more chances of using up the resources. It is less cost effective. So the biggest advantage, or the only advantage of sexual reproduction, is that you end up with greater variation in your offspring. C. Which type of the life cycle has both a haploid and diploid multicellular stage? Is it A, an asexual life cycle, B, diploid dominant, C, haploid dominant, or D, alteration of generations? If you said D, alteration of generations, I would agree with you. So of course, with our ferns here, we have a multicellular sporophyte and we have a multicellular gametophyte. Okay, so that's present in both diploid and haploid stages. Whereas in us humans, our haploid stage, we just have our single-celled gametes. In the fungi, they have, the haploid spores that, can be multicellular hyphae, and then the diploid, they have the zygospores that can be produce. I guess that is considered multicellular. I can't really tell. I guess sort of. Well, it fuses to a zygospore, so I guess that's not really considered a, I think that's just a single individual cell. Okay, so those, so D is the only one that actually has a physical multicellular diploid and haploid stage. Okay. And then finally, what event leads to a diploid cell in a life cycle? So what leads to the creation of a diploid cell? Is it A, meiosis, B, fertilization, C, alteration of generations, or D, mutation? So of course it's fertilization. Okay, so haploid sperm meets haploid egg, you get diploid zygote. Haploid egg, haploid sperm meets, you get diploid zygote. Okay, so all of these plus, minus, diploid zygote. Okay, so all of these involve fertilization. Great, so that's it for sexual reproduction. By now you should be able to explain that variation among offspring is a potential evolutionary advantage resulting from sexual reproduction. You should also be able to describe the 3 different life cycle strategies among sexual multicellular organisms and their commonalities. So for the next section, we're going to finally get into meiosis. Okay, so it's if you understood mitosis really well, you should be able to get meiosis pretty easily. Okay, so it's somewhat similar to mitosis, but there are some differences that we'll learn about. Okay.